Freud and Psychoanalysis, a History Day project by Vanessa Gendro and Emily Roach.
Psychoanalysis was developed by Sigmund Freud in Vienna, Austria in the late 19th century, although it is still being used today. Psychoanalysis is most commonly used to treat depression and anxiety patients. Freud's account of sexual genesis and nature of neurosis led him naturally to develop a clinical treatment for treating such disorders. Freud's books and lectures brought him both fame and ostracism from the mainstream of the medical community. He drew around him a number of very bright sympathizers who became the core of psychoanalytic movement.
Unfortunately, Freud had a penchant for rejecting people who did not totally agree with him. Some separated from him on friendly terms, others did not, and went on to found competing schools of thought. Psychoanalysis is the root of all contemporary forms of psychotherapy. As a clinical modality, it has had an enormous impact on the treatment of medical illness and on the fields of psychology and psychiatry.
A turning point in recognition by the others came in 1909, when Freud was invited to America to give a series of lectures at Clark University and to receive an honorary degree.
It seemed like the realization of some incredible daydream. Psychoanalysis was no longer the product of delusion. It had become a valuable part of reality. Sigmund Freud.
Still, the future of psychoanalysis was anything but secure. Freud's most famous protégés, including Jung, began to differ with him on key points. Freud, the father figure of the movement, would not tolerate this kind of rebellion.
Before the eminent Austrian psychologist Dr. Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis in the late 19th century, there were many theories but little scientific knowledge about the inner workings of the human mind. People were much more superstitious. People were believed to behave the way they did for numerous reasons. The will of gods, demonic possession, inherit good or evil from birth, imbalance of humors, and so forth. Criminals who committed crimes against society or those who demonstrate bizarre behavior were simply removed from society with little hope for meaningful rehabilitation.
Psychoanalysis was developed with the help of three people: Sigmund Freud, Dr. Joseph Breuer, his mentor and friend, and Breuer's patient, Anna O.
In the history of science, it is not often that it falls to the lot of a single investigator to inaugurate an entirely new method of research or to discover a whole group of general laws, each valid, each equally fundamental. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, has done both. He has inaugurated the analytic method of inquiry, which is being successfully applied to all the manifestations and products of mental activity. And through the careful use of this technique, he has uncovered fundamental principles hitherto either wholly unrecognized or perceived but vaguely. For the first time, psychoanalysis introduces true order and understanding into some of the most obscure and baffling provinces of the mind: phobias, compulsions, obsessions, and dreams.
In 1938, during the last year of his life, Sigmund Freud was old and sick, but his mind was still sharp.
I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis.
And with psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud opened the doors to the unconscious, forever changing the way we view the human mind.
For the first time, too, we are acquiring true insight into the meaning, the psychic development, and mechanism of the most dreadful impersonal calamities, mental breakdown or insanity, and through the aid of psychoanalysis, helping to cure these disorders.
Mental patients were treated like outcasts. They were put in asylums and received antiquated, and in some cases, even barbaric care. Treatments included alternating hot and cold baths, lengthy periods of drug-induced sleep, and in some cases, brain surgery that resulted in death.
At the end of the 18th century, Philippe Pinel called it mental alienation. All this was seen by naturalists, materialists, and vitalists as the inevitable results of instincts getting out of control, as an inevitable and irreversible physical and moral inheritable degeneration of the lowest layers of society. In this context, the idea of unconscious drives was born. Sigmund Freud was born May 6, 1856, in a small town, Freiberg in Morava. Sigmund had 2 older half-brothers and 6 younger siblings. When he was 4 or 5, he wasn't sure, the family moved to Vienna, where he lived most of his life. After spending a short time as a resident in neurology and the director of a children's ward in Berlin, he came back to Vienna, married his patient fiancée Martha Bernays, and set up a practice in neuropsychiatry with the help of Joseph Breuer.
Freud immigrated to England just before World War II, when Vienna became an increasingly dangerous place for Jews, especially once as famous as Freud. Not long afterward, he died of a cancer in the mouth and jaw that he had suffered from for the last 20 years of his life.
Anna O. was Joseph Breuer's patient from 1880 through 1882. 21 years old, Anna spent most of her time nursing her ailing father. She developed a bad cough that proved to have no physical basis. She developed some speech difficulties, then became mute, and then began speaking only English rather than her usual German. When her father died, she began to refuse food and developed an unusual set of problems. She lost the feeling in her hands and feet, developed some paralysis, and began to have involuntary spasms. She also had visual hallucinations and tunnel vision. But when specialists were consulted, no physical causes for the problems could be found. If all this weren't enough, she had fairy tale fantasies, dramatic mood swings, and made several suicide attempts. Breuer's diagnosis was that she was suffering from what was then called hysteria, which meant she had symptoms that appeared to be physical, but were not.
Joseph Breuer can to some extent be regarded as the grandfather of psychoanalysis. In Vienna, from a family involved in Judaic religious instruction, Breuer became quickly devoted to his medical studies. In 1967, he was awarded the private docent title, but gave up a university career to dedicate himself to private customers.
Simultaneously with his clinical practice, Breuer carried out research tasks at the Institute of Physiology, directed by Ernest von Breuer. It is in this context that in 1880 he met Freud, his 14 years junior. The relationship between Freud and Breuer was rather characteristic of the links that Freud would establish during those years and even later, with their mixture of dependence, admiration, and competition.
Breuer played a paternal role for Freud, even financially supporting his younger colleague in the years when he established his family life. The found of Anna O. case treated by Breuer was to be the source of work leading the publications such as famous studies on hysteria in 1895.
Psychoanalytic theory was an enormously influential force during the first half of the 20th century. Those inspired and influenced by Freud went on to expand upon Freud's ideas and develop theories of their own. Psychoanalysis has made many contributions to the development of other psychotherapies, but in particular its understanding of attachment theory, transference, resistance, and trauma have been studied on many other mental health professionals and incorporated into their own theories and practices. Psychoanalysis continues to make important contributions to basic clinical understanding of adaptive and maladaptive psychological development, and particularly to the understanding of depression and its treatment. The official history of psychoanalysis, as laid down by Sigmund Freud's biographer, Ernest Jones, has turned out to be a complete mystification aimed at covering up the fact that Sigmund Freud was a pathological liar, a quack, a swindler, a firm believer in the paranormal and everything metaphysical, ending up with metapsychological, that is, pseudoscientific theories. The internationalist communists left very little published on psychoanalysis, or for that matter, on psychology in general. Yet the impact of psychoanalysis on society has been enormous. It can even be characterized as one of the main ideologies of the 20th century. It has directly affected the private lives of hundreds of millions of families in the period around the Second World War. It has influenced business policies, the world of marketing and publicity. It even inspired art and literature. Psychoanalysis was beneficial at the time it was developed, which was around the Second World War. It helped treat a number of people who were left with psychological problems and mental illnesses caused by World War II.
Developed psychoanalysis in the late 19th century. Psychoanalysis is the foundation for all contemporary forms of psychotherapy. Clinical modality. Psychoanalysis has had a huge impact on the treatment and medical illness on the fields of psychology and psychotherapy.
Self-control, more vitality and more capacity for work. This result is enjoyed without any of the unpleasant aftermaths which accompany exhilaration from alcoholic means.
Anxious to capitalize on his discovery, Freud published a paper extolling the drug's virtues. But Freud deeply regretted his haste after the drug's addictive properties became known.
Psychoanalysis helps to make the unconscious conscious and finding the root of the problem, thusly gaining a better understanding of the problem and possibly a solution. Whatever the reason, psychoanalysis has helped improve the lives of many people.